Hello, welcome to the Virtual Classroom, U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Now let's get right to it. As you can see, the topic today is the Cold War era of the modern civil rights movement. Now, before we get started today, please hit pause on your browser. Take a moment, write down the lecture outline, and specifically noting the key terms, which will come in handy later. Now, let's get right to this. Now, what we've been talking about in our last lecture was kind of these two major consensus that developed during the late 1930s into the 1940s. And of course, the first one being the liberal consensus that began with the presidency of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's a topic we will come back to many more times this semester. The second consensus, where we left off in our last lecture, was, of course, the Cold War consensus that developed in the years following World War II. Now, on the one hand, this consensus created patriotic Americans that pitted democratic capitalism against the evil USSR and their totalitarian communism. However, there was a dirty underside to this consensus, and that, of course, was that it created and emphasized conformity above all else. Now, this conformity to some people make us look longingly at this period as the quote-unquote good old days. However, as we noted, for many people, that was not always the case. We also began to see that even during the middle 1950s, that there began to be a number of cracks in this consensus. We talked about a few of them last time. Things like rock and roll, things like youth rebellion, things like writers and poets of the Beat Generation and others who began to rail against the crash consumerism and the conformity and the government surveillance that surrounded things like McCarthyism and HUAC. However, I kind of left off on a cliffhanger because while all those were definite cracks, the greatest fissure of the conformity culture of the 1950s, of course, was the modern civil rights movement of African Americans. Now, before we get to actually talk about the movement itself, we need to go back and contextualize to understand what really set up this movement. And of course, that is, World War II. Now, World War II cannot be separated from the modern civil rights movement for a number of reasons. Now, please don't misquote me, first of all. The modern civil rights movement does not begin in the 1940s during World War II. We've been talking about African American civil rights ever since the Civil War ended. And of course, if you go back further, even before the war, questions of what role, what rights do African Americans have in our society. However, World War II, it can easily be argued, becomes a major turning point in the civil rights movement because soldiers went off to war, and as they're fighting in segregated units, they begin to develop a more militant, more radical agenda for when they came back home. And African American soldiers abroad, African American leaders back in the United States began to develop and argue what they needed was a double V campaign. Yes, we need victory abroad. We need to defeat totalitarian governments. We need to defeat fascism, Nazism, militarism. All those things must be defeated. However, they also need to defeat racism here at home. And so the Double V campaign became this very powerful rallying cry for African Americans during the post-World War II period, as they are suffering through segregation in the military and then returning home to a racially segregated society. Remember, World War II was patriotic. It was pitched as this war for the American public to root out tyranny, root out racism and fascism and Nazism. Remember, Hitler was killing people based on race, murdering, mass executions, and yet African American soldiers are returning home and they're facing, violence. They're facing riots. They're facing just segregation, Jim Crow laws of the South. and they were facing stiff resistance. But, as I noted earlier, World War II would see a tremendous increase in civil rights activism for African Americans. I believe the stat I left you off with a couple lectures ago was, of course, the NAACP membership during World War II climbed from about 50,000 to more than 450,000 over the course of the war. Now, one of the emerging leaders of the civil rights movement was a man by the name of Walter White. You see him pictured here. And while he was the first to organize an Atlanta chapter of the NAACP after he had graduated from the historically black Atlanta University, he began to work not only for civil rights, but he began to work for education of African American children in the Atlanta area. Now, I'm sure many of you are looking at this picture and saying, wait, this guy was the leader of the NAACP? He looks a little white. Well, the fact is, he does. And he had the appearance of a white man. And yet, he was indeed African American. In fact, from his autobiography, he says, quote, "I am a Negro. My skin is white, my eyes are blue, my hair is blonde. The traits of my race are nowhere visible upon me." And again, that comes from his autobiography. So, well, first of all, the reason here. The reality is his skin color was the result of tremendous amount of racial mixing in his past, often mostly due to rape. In fact, of his 32 closest relatives, only 5 were actually black. 27 were in fact white. So why was he still considered black? Well, culturally, he grew up in the African American community because America long employed what was called the one-drop rule. If you had even one drop of black blood in your system, you were considered black. And therefore, he was shunned by his, say, white relatives as a black person, leading him to identify culturally and being raised culturally in the African American community. And it is this ability and this understanding that he is culturally black that will drive him to help pursue civil rights for African Americans. And quite honestly, this is a tremendous benefit to him. His appearance as a white man allows him to move freely among, well, the white community. In fact, in one respect, he went to investigate a hate crime against an African American, and while he was in town investigating it, he began interviewing, pretending he was a journalist. And he began doing his thorough investigation to the point where people in town began to get very upset, while the white residents did. And he realized that he better get out of town before he was next on the violence. And as he was getting on the train to go home, the conductor or the ticket taker who took his ticket said, "Hey, did you hear? There's some black man here trying to stir up trouble regarding this person who was beaten via mob violence." And of course, Walter White says, oh yeah, I heard about that. Gets on the train and leaves. And the ticket taker never actually knew that it was him who had been the one investigating because, again, he appeared white. So again, being able to pass for white and talk the language, he could pass through the average white community, but he was still, in his core, an African American. And he'll become very important to African American civil rights movement because he will have the ear of one of the most powerful men in the world. And I mentioned last time that Harry Truman had been one of the very first presidents to really deal with this racism issue. He wanted to put it as part of the Democratic Party platform in 1948. He had commissioned the study of the book to secure these rights about the African American situation in America. And he will appear numerous times, as you can see here, talking to Harry Truman. And this is going to get him much more notoriety, yes, but it provides an influential understanding of what life is like for African Americans. And it's because of this connection that Walter White is able to pursue civil rights legislation, pursue civil rights justice. such as in the case of one of the most famous cases he dealt with was the case of an African-American GI by the name of Isaac Woodard, pictured here. Now, Isaac Woodard was a Black American GI. He had been in the South Pacific fighting against the Japanese. He fought, of course, in a segregated Black unit. Well, in February 1946, he returned from his duty. He was honorably discharged, and he boarded a bus in Georgia to return home back to South Carolina. Now, please note, as you see in the picture here, on the bus that day, as he boarded the bus, he was wearing his full military uniform, just as you see in the picture there. This is important because you would think that having your military uniform would afford you some level of respect. I mean, you were out fighting for the United States patriotically, and yet you're still treated like garbage when you come home. And of course, as we've noticed already, this is already a common theme. Well, sure enough, Isaac Woodard gets on the bus, and he begins to ride from Georgia back to South Carolina. Now, along the way, Isaac Woodard, like many people, had to stop and use the bathroom. So he went to the forward, he asked the bus driver, "Hey, sir, can I use the bathroom at the next stop?" And it proceeded to create a small argument between the two. After which the bus driver grudgingly acceded and said, "Sure, why not?" So the next stop, Isaac Woodard got the bus, he went to the bathroom, he got back on, and they proceeded on their way. Well, at the next stop, the driver called the police, who boarded the bus and forcibly removed Isaac Woodard from the bus. Please note, Woodard did not resist arrest. He went along willingly, not trying to cause trouble. What happened next, though, was that the police demanded to see Woodard's discharge papers, presuming, of course, that he had been dishonorably discharged, which he was not. And then they took him back behind his shed and proceeded to beat him with their nightsticks and batons. He was then taken into town and arrested for disorderly conduct. The charge was that he had been drinking beer in the back of the bus with other soldiers and causing a small ruckus. He had been beaten so badly. I'm sure if you look closely at this picture right now, you'll start to see it. Those are not sunglasses he's wearing. The policeman had beat him so severely that he suffered partial amnesia and blindness due to the beatings. In fact, here's the coroner's report from afterward, and you can see it here. It says his eyes were examined on April 25th and found that the right eye had a healed rupture of the bulb. The eye had already undergone marked degeneration. The left eye also showed rupture of the bulb. The left eye, the degeneration was also present. Diagnosis? Well, blindness. Prognosis? Hopeless. So here we have an American GI who survived the battle in the Pacific. Yet he returns home to Georgia to go home to South Carolina, honorably discharged from the military, served his country proudly, boarded a bus, and because he asks to go to the bathroom, he is beaten to the point where he suffers partial amnesia and is now blind. Well, quite honestly, after this took place, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. However, soon African-American journalists and the NAACP began to get wind of what happened to Isaac Woodard. And they began to publicize Woodard's plight. So much so that Walter White began to talk about Isaac Woodard to Harry Truman. Now, it took 7 months. This was not quick. But 7 months later, Walter White pushed Truman to look into it because, quite honestly, the local law enforcement was having no part of it. In their minds, this is what he deserved. Go back to this picture for you real quick. Finally, Walter White was able to push Truman to look into it. And it took a very short investigation, and big surprise, several of the officers, including the chief of police, Linwood Shull, were indicted. So again, the results of this very short investigation was yes, These police officers acted inappropriately, presumed, including indicted was the chief of police, a man by the name of Linwood Shull. So now it goes to trial. And the trial, I wish I could say was good, but the reality was it was a travesty. Because the prosecution, the ones trying to convict these police officers, they failed to interview a single witness other than the bus driver. And I'm pretty sure you can figure out what his view was. The defense attorney, the one defending the police, he randomly would shout racial epithets at Woodard during the trial, and even at one point stated, quote, "If you rule against Shull," the chief of police, "then let the South Carolina secede again." Now, Woodard would give his account. He would testify on his own behalf, in which Shull will deny. So now it's his word, an African American, against the chief of police, a white man. Shull not only denied it, but he claimed that Woodard had actually threatened him with a gun. The jury went to deliberate. They took about 30 minutes. And the jury found Shull innocent. And the courtroom broke out in applause upon hearing this free verdict. So obviously justice was not served. But Isaac Woodard does mean something to our country, not only as a proud serviceman, not only for the tragedy he ensued, but his case was a larger case of what was going on of the modern day lynching. Remember, we talked about lynching back in the 1800s, but lynching had still been a major problem going into the 1950s now, 1940s, 1950s. And this is important because this was a case of extrajudicial violence, mob violence conducted by the police, where they beat a man to the point of amnesia and blindness. And I'm going to show a quick recap here of some of the older lynch. Remember, the idea, going back to the Birth of a Nation movie, glamorizing, glorifying this idea of lynching, extrajudicial punishment through mob violence. And lynching became this very prevalent way that was just a normal part of Southern society to reinforce what they viewed as social justice, to keep blacks in their place. It was used to strike fear in the hearts of African Americans, to illustrate the power of white supremacy, and of course to entrench the Jim Crow South. And these lynchings became these public spectacles. And remember, these are not just people in the backwoods. These are community events where everyone is taking part. This is a picture I've showed in the past regarding lynching. You notice the person in the bottom right corner who's smiling as this man, Jesse Washington, has been burned before he's hung. And of course, here's the very famous postcard that Texans sent of commemorating their time. As you see the man there posing next to the dead body of Jesse Washington. And so while these cases have been building and building and building, the case of Isaac Woodard begins to bring it to the forefront again in the post-World War II double V movement for civil rights. But one thing has changed this time for African Americans. One thing has changed for Walter White that gives him, well, an ace up the sleeve. And that is Harry Truman and that Cold War consensus. On the one hand, it emphasizes conformity, which in some Southerners' minds meant, well, lynching, meant keeping African Americans, quote unquote, in their place. However, the Cold War was this bigger, larger issue. And the Soviets were smart at this, and they were smart with their propaganda because the Soviet Union began to use America's racial problems to show the hypocrisies of the democratic capitalist system. They said, wait, democratic capitalism is so great? I mean, how is lynching African Americans, how is maiming African Americans that much different than Hitler was doing to Jews? And they begin to use this within the Cold War context, saying, well, wait, hold on. Why would you want to live there in America under this system that systematically excludes, segregates, harms, vilifies, and even kills certain members of their society just because of the color of their skin. Come join communism because, well, under communism, everyone is equal. And this became the propaganda push. America bills itself as the land of the free, and lynchings, whether it's Jesse Washington or Isaac Woodard, this undermines the U.S. propaganda of what makes the United States so great. And Harry Truman, the U.S. government, does not want to concede any points to the Soviet Union. And so the civil rights movement becomes a major push for the Truman administration. And as I've already said, he's become a very strong advocate for civil rights legislation. We talked about his desegregation, the integration of the military through executive order. But of course, all that changes in the 1952 election when Eisenhower takes office in 1953 for Harry Truman. Remember, Eisenhower is more Republican. He is a Republican. He's more moderate. And he was not looking to shake things up domestically like Harry Truman was. Remember, he supported the New Deal legislation, but he doesn't want to see it expand. He is much more focused on the Cold War international issues. And he doesn't want to rile things up, and he doesn't have the push for civil rights that Truman did at the national level. In fact, Eisenhower believed that the U.S. government, the federal government, should not really interfere when it came to civil rights issues, but rather, civil rights issues needed to be done at the state level. In fact, you see the quote here. He says that, "I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions." In other words, you can't change the morals of a person. You can't make someone like a person of another skin color through a law. And therefore, he believed it needed to be a bottom-up movement, not a top-down movement. And quite honestly, he might be right. He may have been right. However, it will never get really the chance to be proven, because during his tenure in office, this U.S. Supreme Court is going to land a bunch of major legislative court decisions. They're going to be vital to the civil rights movement. And of course, the biggest of all of them, of course, is the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case. Now, here you see on your screen two very prominent African-American lawyers. You have Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall. These two men are going to argue case after case after case before the Supreme Court in trying to overturn segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, and civil rights legislation, trying to make it better for African Americans in the United States. And of course, they've been trying for, well, ever since the end of the Civil War. But finally, in the 20th century, the NAACP have been trying to get that separate but equal, the Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine, removed. And it was these two lawyers who will argue one of the biggest civil rights cases in our U.S. country's history. And in 1954, they will finally get a victory in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Now, this case began as young African Americans began to argue that under the equal protection law of the 14th Amendment, that African Americans should not be denied access to white schools. Now, we've already discussed this back in the Gilded Age, that the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling said, the Supreme Court said, hey, as long as things are equal, they can be separate. Now, we all know it was always separate, never equal. But that became the law and the guiding principle of our land. What changed here was not just the law itself or the interpretation of the law, but that Marshall and Houston began to argue that there were sociological and psychological differences, that even if You have separate facilities. And even if they were completely 100% equal, the very fact that you are separating, on the one hand, whites, on the other hand, African Americans, that very fact creates a superior, inferior mentality. And therefore, in the Supreme Court, in their decision, will cite these sociological and psychological findings that separating people based on race creates and engenders feelings of inferiority. This was a clear reversal of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And surprisingly, this was a unanimous decision. So this was a tremendous victory. Hallelujah. This is a victory. African Americans get a victory. The High Court, Supreme Court bans segregation in public school systems. This is a clear victory. One problem, well, many problems, but the one most pressing problem is the Supreme Court ruled that these were now illegal. They were unconstitutional. They did not provide equal access, equality under the 14th Amendment. So legally, things have changed. But the Supreme Court never gave a definitive timetable to actually integrate schools. In fact, what their interpretation, what their stance was, what their statement was that racial integration of public schools should move, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed. I'm going to repeat that. Supreme Court ruled that yes, segregation is unconstitutional, but that racial integration of schools should occur with quote unquote all deliberate speed. So what does that mean? Well, if you're African Americans, that means tomorrow you can go enroll in public schools alongside whites. But if you're a white person who believes staunchly in segregation, Jim Crow laws, and has extreme racism, when is all deliberate speed take place? When is that date? I mean, maybe you mean one thing in, say, New York or maybe Los Angeles. It means something totally different in places like Birmingham, Alabama, Philadelphia, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia. It means something very different there. So all deliberate speed means different things to different people. Now, you remember what Eisenhower said about laws and court decisions? Yeah, he very well may have supported civil rights. But privately, he said, quote, the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court decision, quote, set back progress in the South at least 15 years. The fellow who tries to tell me you can do these things by force is just plain nuts, unquote. And so the immediate results of the Brown v. Board of Education case are quite mixed. Now, there will be some token integration, especially in northern cities. But in the South, for much of the rest of the decade, it is almost non-existent. In fact, Eisenhower says it's just plain nuts, and he refused to take part in any leading of white Southerners to force them to comply with the Brown ruling. And that was the good response. The bad response comes from Southerners themselves, which we will see in our next lesson. So until then, bye-bye.